Welcome to the Daily Insider here on VegasInsider.com. I am Kevin Rogers, and today is the final day of the second round of the NCAA Tournament for Monday, March 22nd, 2021. Our friend Tom Cunningham will be back in a few days. He's taking a few days off, so we'll talk to him likely on Wednesday for that edition of the Daily Insider. And after today, we will know who is in the Sweet 16. We already know most of the teams in the Sweet 16 in two of the regions, and a little bit of a surprise in some of it. So let's take a look at the brackets right now before we look ahead to today's action. Yesterday, the teams that advanced in the NCAA tournament, first in the South, Baylor beats Wisconsin 76-63. They cover as 6.5-point favorites, and Baylor pretty much in control of that whole game. They haven't been terribly sharp since their COVID break, so this was probably one of their best performances since then, and they really needed it. They beat Hartford in the first round. They didn't cover as 25.5-point favorites. They won by 24, but Baylor really showed up and played well against Wisconsin, who blew out North Carolina in the previous round. And again, the Big Ten, it's been a tough sledding for the Big Ten so far. And a lot of teams keep dropping by the day. Today, you have Michigan, Iowa, Maryland. They all play, but a lot of the big-time teams in the Big Ten have dropped out. Of course, it was Ohio State on Friday against Oral Roberts in the 2:15 game. And also, we'll get to Rutgers, their meltdown against Houston, and what happened with Michigan State in the opening round in the first four against UCLA. So a lot of these Big Ten teams, and Purdue even losing in overtime to North Texas on Friday, they've had a lot of problems. And, the thought was maybe the Big Ten would have two teams go to the Final Four, maybe three in the Elite Eight, but that's not the case. As, Maryland's a big, or they're an underdog today to Alabama, and Michigan's a favorite today, but even Iowa, too, favored against Oregon. But, those games are kind of up in the air, so you never know. But Baylor ends up advancing. They'll face Villanova in the Sweet 16. That's going to be a terrific matchup. Villanova knocked off Winthrop in the first game on Friday night by 10, laying 6. They beat up North Texas laying 6 last night, 84-61. North Texas, who was coming off that huge win over Purdue in overtime, they shouldn't have enough for this Villanova team. And you see how great of a coach Jay Wright is, that he loses Colin Gillespie to the knee injury in the Creighton game towards the end of the season. They lose the final two to Providence to end the regular season, then against Georgetown in the Big East tournament as a 1 seed, and it didn't matter because Villanova ends up winning the first two in convincing fashion, both by double digits. So now they get Baylor, and Baylor laying 6.5 in that game coming up in the Sweet 16. The bottom half of that South bracket, Texas Tech ends up losing to Arkansas by 2. So Arkansas, after they had a bit of a slow start against Colgate in the first round and then ended up blowing them out, and then they edged Texas Tech, the reigning runners-up in the tournament from 2 years ago against Virginia. So Texas Tech is out. Arkansas faces Oral Roberts. Arkansas was on the verge of playing Florida in an SEC battle, but Oral Roberts pulls off another upset. They become the second ever 15 seed to make it to the Sweet 16. The first was Florida Gulf Coast, and coincidentally, Florida Gulf Coast lost to Florida in the Sweet 16, and this time the 15 seed Oral Roberts knocks off Florida as they come back and win by 3. So Arkansas now an 11.5-point favorite against Oral Roberts, and the Razorbacks coming off as a 2-point dog against Texas Tech, now double-digit favorites. You don't see that often, that big of a flip. But, of course, that's the case because Arkansas was one of the top teams in the SEC, and Oral Roberts was a 15 seed, and they weren't even a top seed in the Summit League. So we'll see if Oral Roberts can pull off another upset. But obviously a very tough region there to get through if you're, Oral Roberts try to beat the likes of Arkansas. And when you look at even Villanova, if they had to beat Baylor and then Arkansas, that would be tough. And even for Arkansas, they have, quote-unquote, the easiest road, but even if they beat Oral Roberts, you still play a quality opponent coming up in the Elite Eight. So let's go down to the Midwest now. And the big upset yesterday, we call Oral Roberts over Florida an upset, but Loyola Chicago, you could the judgy part about it is the seeding for Loyola Chicago was a bit of an underservice for them because they were higher than an 8 seed. And, the discussion was, why did Illinois have to draw a team like Loyola Chicago in the second round? I mean, besides geographic reasons, to see these two teams play each other that don't normally play each other. And Illinois ends up just down the whole game to Loyola Chicago, that they were never really in it, that it felt like Loyola Chicago was in control the whole game, one of the top defensive teams in the country. They were in the Final Four in 2018, and when you look at their region now, they are an 8 seed, but they're favored by 7 against Oregon State in the Sweet 16, and Oregon State coming off 2 really good wins against high opponents, against Power 5 opponents in Tennessee and Oklahoma State, winning by 14, winning by 10, and in control of both those games. But Loyola Chicago, it's not crazy to think that they can't beat Oregon State and then face either Syracuse or Houston, which is going to be a very tough matchup. We see how well Syracuse has looked in their first 2 games. I mean, the game was a little close against West Virginia. The final score closer than indicated. Syracuse was in control of that game. But Houston, who needed, a 13-2, 14-2 run towards the end of that game to beat Rutgers. I mean, Rutgers got to be kicking themselves for, they had Houston down and they just couldn't close that one out. They do cover as 7.5-point dogs, but obviously no one had Loyola Chicago, Oregon State, Syracuse, and Houston in the Sweet 16 of the Midwest. I mean, no one has that. It's mathematically impossible. No one's going to see that one coming. And Oregon State played very well in the Pac-12 tournament, obviously, and they've taken that momentum, winning those games against UCLA and Oregon and Colorado, who are still alive. Like, think about that with the Pac-12. Oregon State has had 2 convincing wins so far. Granted, Oregon hasn't played yet because of the VCU COVID issue, so Oregon plays Iowa today, and they'll be tested in the opening game. But UCLA has won twice already because they played in the first 4, and they rallied past Michigan State, and Colorado destroyed Georgetown. And that's the one I loved in the first round. I said it all week in the live stream that Colorado was going to beat Georgetown and cover, not think they win by 23, but Colorado, I just thought that was such a mismatch against Georgetown. So let's move now to the East. We'll go from the East then up to the West. Today's matchups in the East, Michigan, LSU. And start with Michigan first. They end up beating Texas Southern. They don't cover as 25-point favorites, so be it. So they move on to LSU. It's a good football game today. LSU, they were in control of that St. Bonaventure game. St. Bonaventure, who won the Atlantic 10 regular season, won the Atlantic 10 tournament, and yet they just didn't play well. Simple as that. And LSU's a good team. LSU took Alabama to the wire in the SEC championship. They also had some good wins in the SEC, also had some questionable losses, so up and down, but they got the up in the game against St. Bonaventure on Saturday. So now they get Michigan as a short dog, and LSU, who has been tested and has gone deep in the tournament before. So let's not forget that with Will Wade. He may have some shady stuff, on the side with recruiting things, but he's still a good coach because LSU right there against Michigan, and no reason to think LSU couldn't win this game today. And they're getting 5 against Michigan. The other game in the East, that top half, Colorado and Florida State, which is going to be a dynamic game tonight. Seminoles laying 1.5 against the Buffaloes, and Colorado, who made it to the Pac-12 championship, lost to, as we see, a really good Oregon State team, so no shame in that. A team they beat twice in the regular season, but then lost them in the Pac-12 title game. But Colorado, who beat USC 3 times, and also beat UCLA, beat Oregon, lost to Washington, lost to Cal. I can't forget to mention that. I have to. So they've had some really head-scratching losses this year, Colorado. But Florida State, it feels like they had UNC Greensboro at arm's distance the whole way. They would get up, and then UNC Greensboro would make it close again, but then FSU doesn't cover the 10.5. So now is FSU going to get that breakout game against Colorado today, or tonight rather, and the Buffaloes just dominated the Hoyas of Georgetown, 96-73, never in doubt win for Colorado, and this is a big measuring stick for them because they're a team that really hasn't been deep in the tournament a lot. So they will be tested. That top 4 You can make arguments for any of those 4 teams to get to the Elite Eight, really. Michigan, LSU, Colorado, and Florida State. Now, that bottom half, nobody saw this one. UCLA and Abilene Christian. All right, Abilene Christian knocks out Texas on Saturday night. They hit on Saturday. I've lost track of the days with all these movements. On Saturday night, hitting a couple late free throws. Abilene Christian, one of the top defenses in the country out of the Southland Conference. Now UCLA, they go from an underdog against Michigan State, win that game in overtime, underdog against BYU, dominate them, win by 11, getting 3.5, to now a favorite in this round, laying 5. That number was just 4.5. Now it's jumped up to 5 against Abilene Christian. And a couple notes on Texas here. I just want to go back to the Texas game for a second. There were 7 teams, 7 out of the Big 12 that made it to the tournament. Texas was the only one that lost in the first round, which is kind of crazy. They were the last one to play, and they end up losing. There were 7 teams in the state of Texas that made the tournament. 6 of them won in the first round. Only team to lose was Texas. So the Longhorns, who won the Big 12 championship, the Big 12 tournament championship, they can't even beat not Houston or Rice or Texas A&M or someone outside of the Big 12 or UTEP, someone like that outside of the Big 12 from the Lone Star State, but the Abilene Christian Wildcats out of the Southland. And I don't want to take away from them because they did a magnificent job this year. Look at their record. But, man, if you're Texas, you really got to be kicking yourself. And I don't have the number in front of me, but since Shaka Smart went to the Final Four with VCU and then went to Texas, the Longhorns have won, I think, 2 tournament games. I think it's like 2-5 or 2-6. That's just nutty. And I know they've had some insane losses. The guy threw up the 3-pointer at the buzzer from Northern Iowa from half court. And they lose by 1 to Abilene Christian, and they had that big lead. They lost to Nevada in overtime a few years ago in the first round. They were in control of that game. So there's been some real questionable losses by Texas that have come down to the end. But you say, how do you lose these games? But regardless, so Abilene Christian gets UCLA. Now on the bottom, it's Maryland and Alabama. Iona hung with Alabama for a bit. Pitino's done a really good job with Iona, but they're not going to live up to Alabama. They're not going to be Alabama. Simple as that. They don't have the athletes. So Alabama ends up winning. I'd like them to go to the Final Four from the beginning. Granted, it's been 1 round. But they face Maryland, who was in control against UConn the whole game on Saturday. They beat UConn by 9. And the Big Ten, again, did not have much success. Maryland was one of the bright spots from the weekend. There was a tweet out there that Alabama, when you look at the bracket, they face the 15 seed Iona. They're going to face the 10 seed Maryland. If Alabama ends up winning tonight, I'm going to say assuming, but if they win tonight, because Maryland, they could beat them. But Maryland has some good wins this year. They beat Illinois on the road. They beat Wisconsin on the road. So it's not crazy to think Maryland could beat Alabama. But Alabama gets the winner of UCLA Abilene Christian. So Alabama could face 3 double-digit seeds in the first 3 rounds. And somebody pointed out one of the Gator teams from a few years ago with Billy Donovan was the last team to make the Elite Eight and face all double-digit seeds the first 3 rounds. And, again, luck of the draw, that's all it is. UCLA is not crazy at 11, all right? Abilene Christian, if they somehow beat UCLA and Alabama would have to draw Iona, Maryland, Abilene Christian, you say, wow, that's pretty fortunate. I wouldn't say it's fortunate if they face UCLA in the Sweet 16. They're still a pretty good team out of the Pac-12 who stumbled towards the end. So UCLA as 11 is a little misleading. I don't think they're a true 11 seed, but those are the facts, though. So let's scroll up now to the West. And Gonzaga, Oklahoma, that is the 1-8 game, and Gonzaga laying 14.5 to Oklahoma today. And Oklahoma, who held off Missouri, they had chances in that game. And the Sooners, who were 0-7 against the spread to close out the season. That's a really good win for Lon Kruger. I mean, I got to give him credit there. That Missouri, who, again, one of these up-and-down teams, you had about 4 or 5 really inconsistent teams in this tournament of major conferences that you said could make a run for a few rounds or just get bounced in the first round. I felt like West Virginia could have been one of them. They lost in the second round to Syracuse. Okay. Missouri was one of them. Maryland is one of them. Rutgers was one of them. And Rutgers had Houston dead to rights, and they lose that game. But Oklahoma ends up beating Missouri. I don't know if they have enough firepower to beat Gonzaga today. Maybe they could cover the 14.5, but to outright beat Gonzaga, maybe asking a little too much for that Oklahoma team. But also Oklahoma, in February, was a top 10, top 12 team in the country. So let's not sleep on Oklahoma just yet, but one of their top players was out against Missouri. Creighton and Ohio, that's the second matchup. And Creighton held off UCSB, Santa Barbara, on Saturday night, 63-62, and Santa Barbara had chances in that game, but Creighton survived. They get Ohio, the Bobcats, who beat the reigning national champion Virginia Cavaliers, which makes, in the last three tournaments, Virginia losing to a 13 seed and a 16 seed in the first round, but also somehow winning a championship in between. So Tony Bennett's team has seen the highs and lows very much. It is literally, for Virginia, it's championship or bust. Championship or get knocked out in the first round. And that's what happened with Virginia. But give Ohio credit. Ohio played very well in that game. So Ohio getting 5.5 against Creighton. And so far, these low seeds that won the first round, I'm going to go 13 and below, not necessarily the 12, because we've seen the 12, like Oregon State is still a major team. But looking at the 13, North Texas got blown out by Villanova. Oral Roberts did beat Florida. And that was it. And Abilene Christian plays UCLA later. So you've had two teams that one got blown out and one ended up winning. And honestly, I mean, Florida should have won that game against Oral Roberts. I'm not taking away from them, but, you know, Florida kind of blew it at the end. And Ohio gets Creighton now. I mean, I'm not going to call it toss-up, but that game goes either way, wouldn't be surprised. Another toss-up game, USC and Kansas, and the Trojans laying 1 against the Jayhawks. Kansas holds off Eastern Washington. They were down early in that game. Would not look good for Bill Self. He's had some questionable first-round exits in his career, but they end up winning that game against Eastern Washington. So Kansas gets USC. Andy Enfield has been very good in the tournament over his career, Florida Gulf Coast and then to USC. And USC wins by 16 over Drake. And they pulled away in that game. And as you see, the Trojans laying 1 as a 6 seed. Tells you something. Oregon and Iowa in the bottom of that West region. And Iowa didn't cover against Grand Canyon, the Antelopes. So you had in these the 1 and 2 seeds over their first round games. Gonzaga covered. Iowa didn't. Baylor didn't. Ohio State lost outright. So that's 1 and 3 against the spread. Michigan didn't cover, 1 and 4. Alabama didn't cover, 1 and 5. Houston covered, 2 and 5. Illinois covered, 3 and 5. So 3 and 5 ATS on those 1 and 2 seeds in the first round. But now Iowa goes from laying 13.5 to Grand Canyon to 5 against Oregon. Oregon, the only team that has not played a game yet in the tournament because of VCU's COVID situation. And not to take an opportunity to question or rip the Atlantic 10, but I will, I guess. So if you don't know what happened or you forgot or need to be reminded, the Atlantic 10 was one of a few conferences that took some time off during their conference tournament. Now, why? I don't know. The Atlantic 10 started their conference tournament with a lot of the other mid-majors. And then when they got down to the championship, I believe the championship or the Final Four of their tournament, they had about a week off. And then they played the championship on Selection Sunday. That was one of the 4 or 5 games on Selection Sunday. So they have that, and VCU ends up getting a positive test. And you kind of wonder, in that week off, did the positive test come because you had the week and then you played the game? So, and St. Bonaventure ended up getting blown out in their first game. So the Atlantic 10 had one loss and one forfeit or no contest or however you want to call it. So it didn't look too good for the Atlantic 10 how things turned out with the tournament, and having that week off in between the Atlantic 10 tournament and then the championship didn't look too good. So hopefully they fix that next year. But again, we don't know where we're at next year as far as how everything's going to be. Obviously the COVID situation, how conferences are going to handle everything. So with all that being said, so Oregon ends up not playing a game. So now you're going to get a fresh Oregon team or you're going to get a rusty Oregon team. That's the big question, that they don't have a game under their belts, and Iowa, a very talented team. Oregon, who played very well. I mean, they're obviously a good team, but towards the end of the season, yeah, they slipped up against Oregon State. But again, you look at Oregon and Colorado, they lost to Oregon State in the Pac-12 title game, and or the Pac-12 tournament. It doesn't look that bad for them right now. You would have thought that, those are bad losses. It's not really that bad of a loss because Oregon State's much better than we thought. So Oregon, that's the toughest game on the board just because we haven't seen them play yet. And they could be super fresh and beat Iowa. They could be rusty, hang around. So that one, definitely keep an eye on Oregon and Iowa. And that's the first game, I believe, on the board coming up today in college basketball. That Oregon game is at 12:10 Eastern. You do have a few other games, just to note. What is it? Is this the CIT? It's not the NIT. This is the CBI or one of those other tournaments. Bowling Green and Stetson, Coastal Carolina, Bryant, Longwood and Pepperdine, Bellarmine and Army, and those games are taking place in Florida. So when you look at the road teams, it's all neutral site. I think it's in Daytona. So those games coming up, in case I hate to use the term if you're a real degenerate, good luck with those games. Coming up later. So you have a few other games that are not NCAA tournament games coming up today in college basketball. Let's take a look at the NBA because we've talked a lot of college basketball, which is totally fair. Oh, let me get to the future odds really fast. I mentioned on the screen, so let me get to that. I'll get to NBA in a second. Okay, so here are the future odds for right now. Gonzaga at plus 175 to win the whole thing. Baylor at plus 450. Michigan now moves up to plus 600, 6-1. And Houston, the fourth favorite, at 9-1. Loyola Chicago at 14-1. And if you go deep down the board, Oral Roberts 100-1, Ohio 150-1, Abilene Christian 150-1. But some of the ones that are really curious, all right? Colorado 40-1. They would have to beat Florida State and Michigan, and then perhaps Alabama. Not crazy, but Colorado could be a look at 40-1. The problem is USC is in Gonzaga's region. You got to get through them. Oklahoma plays Gonzaga today. That's a tough one. Here's another one that maybe you could look at. Look at Villanova, 30-1. They would have to beat Baylor and then either Arkansas or Oral Roberts. And remember, this is to win the championship, so you still have 4 more games to win if you're some of these teams. Some of them got to win 5 because they haven't played yet today. But to win 4 more games, I don't think Villanova's crazy at 30-1. Syracuse at 30-1 would have to beat Houston and then either Loyola Chicago or Oregon State to get to the Final Four. Arkansas plays Oral Roberts. They're double-digit favorites, but then you get either Baylor or Villanova. So Arkansas, if you would assume they beat Oral Roberts, they'd be halfway home. Those numbers are going to drop, obviously, 16-1 after they beat Oral Roberts. But Colorado, Oregon also is in Gonzaga's region. But I'm going to throw a couple out at you, okay? And just to keep an eye on. Oregon, let me stop. No, hold on. Let's rewind for a second. Oregon State, 50-1. They've won 2 games already. Colorado still has to win 5 games. They got to beat Florida State. If you get them today, obviously, if they win, their numbers are going to drop. Oregon State, Colorado, Villanova. There are 3, I don't want to call them long shots, but 3 to keep an eye on. Houston at 9-1. They win 2, and they would get Baylor on their side, right? Is that? Let me just double check on that one to see. Let's go back to the brackets for a second. No, Houston would get the East winner, who is, again, why Houston at 9-1. I don't think is nuts either. You get either Michigan, LSU, Colorado, FSU, UCLA, Abilene Christian, Maryland, or Alabama. You avoid Gonzaga and Baylor until the championship, and you hope one of them gets knocked out. So Houston at 9-1, I don't see that as a crazy selection for a Final Four champion. Because I don't like taking the chalk with Gonzaga and Baylor, but just some other teams to keep an eye on. I don't know how much faith I have in Michigan to win the title. I mean, Michigan could lose to LSU and be done. Let's take a look at the NBA quickly because I still want to talk about it since it's here. And in case you are not interested in March Madness, which is totally fine, and you want to talk NBA, you want to look at NBA, or even just kind of get a quick refresher on the NBA in case you've been away from it for a few days, that's fine too. Pacers end up beating the Heat 109-106 in overtime yesterday, so Indiana took 2 from Miami. After the Pacers had this terrible ATS stretch, they end up beating the Heat twice. So the Heat, who have been playing well, they've taken a step back. The Houston Rockets have lost 20 straight games. I did not misspeak. 20 in a row. You know what the record is ATS in that span? 2-18. They've covered twice in the last 20 games. So they're not even losing 20 in a row and being competitive. They are losing 20 straight and not covering. They were laying 4.5 to Oklahoma City. The Thunder were down a couple guys, and Oklahoma City still went in there and won. New Orleans wins at Denver. Really good win for the Pelicans, 113-108. So the Nuggets, who rallied past the Bulls a few nights ago in overtime and have been playing well at home, they get tripped up there by the Pelicans. As you see, trailing by 8 after the first. Big second quarter for New Orleans. And Zion Williamson, another big game. Brandon Ingram, big game. And the Pelicans end up beating the Nuggets. The Celtics finally bounced back. They had lost 3 straight. Bad loss at Cleveland. Bad home loss to Sacramento. And they were down early to Orlando. But the Magic, when they get in their slumps, it's really hard to back them. And the Celtics end up beating the Magic for the second time this year by double digits. The Nets and the Wizards played an uncharacteristically low-scoring game. Look at that total, 249.5 for Washington and Brooklyn. And the Nets win 113-106. That's a lot of non-covers at home for the Nets recently. Against the Knicks, they won, didn't cover. Against the Pistons, won and didn't cover. And against Washington, they won and didn't cover. And that was revenge for Brooklyn after they lost at Washington a few weeks ago. You see Westbrook and Harden there last night, but 249.5, way under after they had a couple games that were huge overs earlier in the season. Chicago beats Detroit 100-86. The Pistons, again, off a victory, they're not good. They were on back-to-back wins last night. So no shot there. And you see the Pistons offense just totally does nothing the last 3 quarters. Scored 61 points. Toronto has now dropped 8 in a row. And they lost at Cleveland, 116-105. Early lead, bad second and bad third. Raptors still dealing with the COVID stuff. But they've lost 8 in a row. And they go to Houston tonight. We'll talk about that in a second. Sixers hold off the Knicks 101-100, but the Knicks covers 1.5-point dogs, depending, I guess, which number you got. Always frustrating when a game goes to overtime, you still stay under. That was the case last night. Philly's actually played well without Joel Embiid. They've actually looked pretty good. I know they lost that Bucks game a few nights ago in overtime, but the Sixers have been all right without Embiid. And the Knicks, a tough home loss, but the Knicks have been a covering machine of late. Well, they didn't cover against Orlando a few nights ago, but New York has been a pretty good team covering the number. In case you missed this one, too, LeBron James is out indefinitely. High ankle sprain he suffered in the loss to Atlanta on Saturday. So LeBron's out, Anthony Davis is out. The Lakers are in trouble. And they go to Phoenix last night, beat the Suns 111-94. Or the Suns beat the Lakers, but I said Lakers beat the Suns, excuse me. Suns beat the Lakers 111-94. They cover the 10.5. And Phoenix remains undefeated this season when they win a game. Well, undefeated against the spread, I should say. Obviously, you're undefeated when you win. But the Suns this year, let's look at the standings really fast. I believe they're at 27 wins, 28-13. The Suns are 28-13 this season. They've covered the spread in 28 victories, which is mind-boggling. Because against Minnesota, they were laying 11 and won by 12 a few nights ago. Every single game they've won, they've covered. So if you like Phoenix to win a game, just lay the points with them. Don't worry about the money line. Just lay the points. That trend will end soon, but to go 28-0 against the spread in your wins is remarkable for the Suns. Dallas ends up beating Portland. They blow them out 132-92. That's revenge for the first game in that two-game set. The Blazers beat the Mavs a few nights ago, but then Dallas was down early, and then Luka was 8 of 9 from three-point range. Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum were something like 0 of 12 from three-point range. You're not going to win. Simple as that, if that's the case. But Dallas now, it is 6 or 7 wins in a row the Mavs have off a loss. So when they lose, they rebound and play well. And in those wins they have off a loss, they've beaten the Nets, they've beaten the Clippers, and they beat another top opponent. Well, hell, I'll look right here and just tell you right now. I'm trying to do this off the top of my head. Looks cooler. Nuggets was the other team they beat. Nuggets, Clippers, Blazers, and Nets off a loss. They've beaten 1, 2, 3. Do this again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 straight wins off a loss for the Dallas Mavericks. Now, looking ahead to tonight, Sacramento and Cleveland. Kings laying 4 in that one against the Cavs, and the Cavs have actually been all right of late. Well, I guess all right up and down. Now they've won 2 of 3. Beat the Celtics at home, lost to San Antonio, and then beat Toronto. So now they get Sacramento and they're a home dog again. You don't see the Kings that often as a road favorite. But Sacramento, they were blown out by Philadelphia. Not a great road, 2 and 3 on the road, but obviously they've not been good covering numbers, the Kings. So they'll get Cleveland a few times here over the next week. Oklahoma City and Minnesota, and the Timberwolves, they actually split a pair of games with the Thunder earlier this season, back in early February. 3-2 were the point margins, and this one's at 2.5, so pretty close. Split the games at Phoenix, and now you have a road trip or a homestand with Oklahoma City, Dallas, then 2 with Houston. I mean, that one, never know if that's going to be the time the Rockets actually snap their skid. Charlotte and San Antonio, LaMelo Ball is out for the rest of the season with a fractured wrist for the Hornets. So, obviously, that's going to hurt his Rookie of the Year odds. I still don't see why he couldn't win Rookie of the Year even if he stopped now, because he's played very well this season. But Charlotte so far 0-3 on their road trip. Blown out by the Nuggets, blown out by the Clippers, lost by 11 to the Lakers. So now maybe you look at them against San Antonio. They'll be a favorite against Houston tomorrow, or when they play them. San Antonio laying 5. They've covered 4 in a row. So the Spurs have actually bounced back since they had these 2 losses to Dallas and Philadelphia. I mean, granted, some of these teams they beat, not exactly a patch in the back for beating Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland. And they hung with Milwaukee. But the Spurs, though, laying 5 at home. Boston and Memphis tonight. The Celtics, a 2-point dog, playing with no rest after the win against Orlando yesterday. And now, not an easy trip. I mean, Memphis is still tough. Milwaukee a few times, then Oklahoma City. But Memphis, this game up here, when Boston blew them out at TD Garden, 126-107 back in December, John Morant was out for that game. And the Grizzlies, trying to get back to 500, split a pair with Golden State, but Steph Curry was hurt. But also, you look at Memphis, off a win of late, lost to Phoenix, lost to the Clippers, did beat Washington, then lost to Milwaukee, lost to Denver, so a couple one-point defeats off a win. losing by 13 to Golden State. So Memphis has been up and down. Indiana, Milwaukee, Giannis Antetokounmpo, he is doubtful with a knee injury tonight. That's why that number is so low with the Bucks laying 5.5. You see Milwaukee, what they've done of late. They've won 6 in a row. And now they get the Pacers, who are off those 2 victories over the Heat on the road. And Indiana just has been inconsistent. Toronto and Houston, we talked about this one earlier. 20 straight losses for Houston, 8 in a row for Toronto, yet the Raptors still laying 8.5, and they're 1-7 with no rest this year. So what gives? And Toronto beat Houston at home earlier in the season by 11. Utah's at Chicago, and the Jazz wrap up their road swing. So 5-game road trip, final game, they're 1-3 ATS. Look at Utah. See, doesn't all this stuff come full circle? They had this huge hot stretch when they went 22-2 or whatever it was, and now look at the Jazz. 0-2, 4-6, 1-6 ATS the last 7 since the start of March. 1-7 for the Jazz. So all of a sudden now, things not looking so hot for Utah, and they got a huge game with Brooklyn coming up at home to return from their road trip, and you get the Bulls tonight, but for Chicago, they have not been a good home underdog this year. So keep an eye on that. Lost to the Heat, lost to the Nuggets, lost to the Suns, beat Sacramento, big deal. Lost to the Clippers, so beat New Orleans here. But they have not been a great home dog this year. So we'll see if Utah bounces back against Chicago. Then the Hawks and Clippers wrap up the night. Hottest team in basketball, the Atlanta Hawks, 8 straight victories. I mean, they got a little bit of good fortune with LeBron getting hurt the other day. But they start this huge road trip. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The only thing I questioned going into that Lakers game the other day was who Atlanta had beaten during the stretch, and all coincidentally with Nate McMillan as their head coach when he took over for Lloyd Pierce. Beat the Heat, all right. Then Orlando, Toronto's been disappointment. Sacramento not good, Cleveland not good, Houston disaster, Oklahoma City not good, and then beat the Lakers. So now you get the Clippers, obviously a huge test. Last time they played, Hawks beat them 108-99. No Kawhi, no Paul George. So now that'll change tonight with the Clippers laying 6.5 at home and the Hawks trying to win their 9th straight game. Now, if you want to find our picks for today in college basketball and the NBA, check out the Buy Picks page on our college basketball arena. And as you see here, I had to put my picks in for the day. That's why I don't have mine up yet. $29.95 for daily picks for each of the experts, and you can find them here. Whoever you want to select, you go to them, you buy the picks, you'd be happy. Expert guaranteed picks or guaranteed expert picks went backwards there. $39.95. Pay after it wins. If it wins one play, you pay. If it loses, you pay nothing. Zero. Zippity-doo-dah. You pay nothing. So these are the guaranteed picks for college basketball. 8 games today. And the same thing in the NBA, as we have picks up for today in the NBA. And also NHL as well. We have picks. Let's not forget about hockey. And a lot of our hockey handicappers on some nice runs there. So in case you are into hockey, you could find them on our NHL arena. So that's it for today's edition of the Daily Insider. And we appreciate you tuning in here for the 11 a.m. start, which we're going to continue. We were doing 1 p.m., but we moved back to 11 a.m. with the tournament. But now that the 11 a.m., a little earlier in the day, it's going to, work out for everyone in that. But don't forget, if you missed anything or you tuned in late, we have the replay up all day. So if you don't tune in exactly at 11 a.m., no big deal. You can watch the replay of the Daily Insider on VegasInsider.com and also find it on our YouTube channel at Vegas Insider. I am Kevin Rogers. Thank you so much for watching the Daily Insider here for Monday, March 22nd, 2021. And we'll talk to you again tomorrow at 11. As always, best of luck with your bets.